remain standing for the hearing of the gospel.
Good morning. Please bear with me. I want to take a quick moment and thank everyone in this congregation. As I come on my third year, having gone through what these people have, I just want to thank you for the warmth and everything you've given me. And if these people get a third of what I got, you're in for a wonderful experience. And it's just an honor to be asked to be your worship leader, and thank you. I hope you'll want to have it happen again. Let's go ahead and have the reading from John 12:20 through 33, based on the Message translation. There were some Greeks in town who had come to worship at the feast. They approached Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. Sorry about that. Sir, we want to see Jesus. Can you help us? Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip together told Jesus. Jesus answered, "Time's up. The time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life, just as it is, destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. If any of you wants to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. The Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. Right now, I am storm-tossed. And what am I going to say? Father, get me out of this? No, this is why I came in the first place. I'll say, Father, put your glory on display. A voice came out of the sky. I have glorified it, and I'll glorify it again. The listening crowd said, thunder. Others said, an angel spoke to him. Jesus said, the voice didn't come for me, but for you. At this moment, the world is in crisis. Now Satan, the ruler of this world, will be thrown out. And I, as I am lifted up from the earth, will attract everyone to me and gather them around me. He put it this way to show how he was going to be put to death. Kind of heavy, but let us now have Steve and Lord bless this to our understanding. Thank you.
Please be seated. Good words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, God, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. We pray in the strong name of Christ. Amen. You know, this morning we said Psalm 51. We read it for our prayer of confession. It's on page 2 of your order of service there. It was actually composed as a song by King David, and it was sung by him to God. Create in me a clean heart, O God, renew a right spirit within me. Not only did David sing it, when others overheard him playing his harp and singing it to God, something happened to them. They heard him singing, and they so connected with this song that they felt they had to preserve it alongside the great psalms of praise, so that everybody could sing it, because it connected here. And we're more used to David's confident, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, or his mystical, oh Lord, you've searched me and known me. You know when I lie down and when I stand up. You knit me in my mother's womb. If I took the wings of the morning and tried to flee from your spirit, lo, you would be there. But today's confessional, create in me a clean heart, O God. Against you have I sinned. My sin is ever before me, is an odd song for a king. Because the most of the kings of the Middle East understood themselves to be gods. And so above the law, they were the gods that made the laws. So kings didn't sing prayers of confession. Israel's leaders in church and society and politics, however, were bound by God to obey the same laws and the same requirements as everybody else. They were not to be above the law. David had been quite upright and true to this point, but when temptation came, and when he wasn't spiritually tuned up, he didn't have the resistance that he needed. I don't know about you, but that spiritual tuning up is for me of critical importance. It's a daily kind of thing. And if it's not something I tend to, if it's not something that I watch for in my prayers and in my walk with God, I can easily slip out of tune. David, who's been so spiritual and so close to God and so virtuous, really, in his treatment of others, begins at this point behaving like other Middle Eastern kings. For example, as commander-in-chief, he is supposed to lead his troops into war if he fights a war. That's the rule. And instead of leading his troops to war this year, David sends them off to fight on his behalf while he stays in the safety of the palace. Now let's face it, if our presidents and our members of Congress were actually required to go and fight the wars they declare, or if presidential candidates were required to pledge themselves to fight in those wars that they propose on the stump, most of our wars wouldn't happen. You would see a ratio of doves to hawks significantly increased. So while the soldiers of King David are off fighting King David's war, David is cruising the neighborhood from the deck of his palace. And he beholds the beautiful Bathsheba on the porch of the house below taking her bath. Now, lest you be thinking she is being seductive by bathing al fresco in the al fresco. Remember that in 1000 BC, all Middle Eastern plumbing is outdoor plumbing, so don't blame the victim. David asks, "Who is she?" And the servants answer that she is unavailable. I mean, they say it right out. She is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's loyal army officers fighting at the front. David is no longer thinking with his head. He sends for her. He doesn't listen. He sends for her. He's the king who has sent for Uriah's wife, while Uriah is fighting for David's kingdom on the battlefield. In this power structure, she has no choice but to obey the king's command. Her life depends upon it. Remember in this patriarchal culture that the commandment against adultery is specifically about a woman being the property of her husband. The anti-adultery law is intended to protect the husband and his legitimate heirs. The faulty understanding of the biology of the period is that the man has all the future babies of his line inside the man, and that in the sexual act, the man deposits baby seeds into the woman, who contributes nothing to the birth process, other than nurturing and incubating environment to grow the man's seeds into a baby. According to the law, the man is only understood as being guilty of adultery if he has relations with a woman who is betrothed or married to another man. And his sin is that the child of the wrong man might inherit the worldly goods that belong to the true heirs of the woman's lawful husband. David disobeyed this law. Within a month of their encounter, Bathsheba realizes she is pregnant, and she tells David by message. When her husband returns from the war, he will know that she slept with another man. So, David adds to his first sin, and he sends for Uriah to come back from the war, to give Uriah a leave so Uriah will sleep with his wife and assume that the baby that arrives is his. But when Uriah returns, he doesn't sleep with his wife because it's not fair to the men in battle who weren't on leave and couldn't sleep with their spouses. So David gets him drunk and sends him back to sleep with his wife. But Uriah proves more moral drunk than David is sober. So now, desperate to conceal his treachery to Uriah, and desperately to conceal his adultery and his failed attempt to cover his deeds, David sends Uriah back to the front carrying a sealed message in his own hand for the general, to be given to the general, which reads, "See that Uriah is put at the front line, the front battle line, and that he is killed." Uriah carefully obeys David's order and delivers his own death sentence to the general. When news of Uriah's death arrives, Bathsheba goes into mourning. There's no indication that she knows that David has had her husband murdered. Then David, playing to look like the hero, sends for this now impoverished widow to come and live at the palace. He's the good big guy. Come and live with the palace with his other wives. Some stories demand music. This story would never make it as a play because it's too cheap and too tawdry. But set to music, call it an opera, it'll fly. The prophet Nathan now comes to David with a message from God. While others may not have known of David's treachery, God knows. Because God has seen what has happened to Uriah. And God has seen what has happened to Bathsheba. And God has seen what has happened to a baby. And God's heart breaks when power hurts the little ones. God knows and is angry that David, who can have as many wives as he wants, has taken the wife of one of his most faithful subjects. And now he's taken that man's life to cover up his treachery with a fake war casualty. This story is a tragedy at every level. The loyal husband and soldier dies. The woman loses the husband she loves, who is executed at the order of a man who has impregnated her. David, the finest and most spiritual of the kings of Israel, falls away from God and from his true self. Nathan confronts David indirectly with a supposed news story about something that's happened in David's kingdom. Nathan tells of a good man who had a favorite little lamb that he's raised to be a sheep as a pet. And it's the only sheep he's got. A greedy neighboring rich man has a lot of sheep, but he decides he wants that man's lamb. And when the owner is unwilling to sell it, the rich man killed him and took that lamb. And David, listening to this story of something like that happening in his kingdom, stands up and shouts, "That man should die!" And the prophet shouts back, "David, you are that man!" And God is angry with what you have done to those poor people. You know, it's amazing to me how we can hear on the news of how the DREAM Act kids are suffering. It's amazing we can hear on the news that 100,000 Iraqi civilians have died in this war, and we can remain unmoved. And then the commercial comes on, after the news, showing a few abandoned or abused dogs and cats, and we who were unmoved at all these kids and all these hundreds of thousands of deaths of foreign, non-combatant men, women, and children, we become outraged at what people could do to abandon these poor little animals. Well, we should be appalled at both. I'm not saying to choose. It's appalling. David is touched by the animal story, and then he sees the true picture of what he's become. And he's cut to his very heart. And again, sometimes words are just not enough. So he wrote that song of confession that we sang this morning, that we read together this morning. The prayer that we said, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, for I've sinned against you." What I did to them hurt you. My sin is now ever before me. Forgive my iniquity. Cleanse my sin. A broken and contrite heart you will not turn away. And you know, people of that day so connected with David's song and those feelings of guilt and shame and self-disappointment that they preserved every word he sang. Music helps us to be joyful, but can also help us to experience and to face the pain of our disappointments and failures and the resultant sadness that comes into our lives and into the lives of others. Music can help us to come to terms with the costs to others of what we've done. Both opera and country and western music proclaim in ways that words can't the cost of our treacheries and broken hearts and broken lives. But the music that helps us truly to confess from the heart also helps us somehow to move forward and to come clean and come to acceptance about what we've done in frailty and our need for God. David's song, acknowledging his own sin and his own need for God's forgiveness and his desire to become a better person and his need for God to help him to move forward with his life and his calling, connected with everybody. You know? Because that being spiritually out of tune and doing one stupid thing in your life that sets a whole bunch of other stupid things in motion is not just David's problem. We can do things we never imagined. We do things that hurt people that we love most. And all of that gets followed by feelings of guilt and shame that are ever before us and that won't go away. Out, damn spot, cries Lady Macbeth. You know, get this guilt out away from me. Because of our human experience. People wrote that song down because in some way it's our song. I keep thinking that David was doing for us what that Roberta Flack song in the last century did. You know, strumming my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly. You know, that being able to identify with what's being sung. David sung, have mercy on me, O God, according to your generous love, according to your grace, wipe out my bad record. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge what I've done. And you know that my sin is always in front of me. I can't get away from it. David is saying now that I realize that I can't think about anything else. My sin is always before me. Do you remember that David's Psalm 51 is the very song that President Clinton quoted when he made his public confession about the White House aid? Mm-hmm. He quoted this song. It's because it still rings true. Now, maybe you've never done anything you really have to be sorry for. Maybe no prophet ever told you an animal abuse story that paralleled your sin. If you've never had to live with guilt or shame about something where your words actually hurt somebody, some unfaithfulness maybe, some gossip, some terribly hurtful thing, written, spoken, or screamed in anger, or if you've never had to live with shame that when you had the chance to do something or say something for the better, you were too afraid, or even remembering over and over your failure to tell people how important they are to you, or how much you love them. If you've never hurt or wounded anybody or ever experienced the deflation and degradation that comes with it, maybe this morning's message just isn't for you. But if you're like me, if you've had more than one time in your life when your sin, that thing that hurt somebody so badly, and that there was that word or action that you would gladly take back, but you can't. It was spoken, it was written, it was done, and it was all the wishing in the world can't make it unspoken or unwritten or undone. And it's kept you awake, or got you depressed, or you drank over it. And then after a while, you couldn't get it out of your head or your heart or your whole system, no matter what you did. Mental, emotional, physical. What a mess. What hurt that other person, or what would have hurt them if they found out, is now killing you. Right? So David sang this confession to God, and God forgave David. And David did the best he could to make things right. He couldn't bring back the dead man. That baby died. And it didn't end like a fairy tale. Everyone lived happily ever after. He did what he could. He married Bathsheba. He promised her that among all the wives, it would be her child who would be the heir to David's throne, and that child was, in fact, King Solomon. The point is that David had to confront himself. David had to confess to God his terrible sin that wrecked and destroyed lives, including his own, because as David sang in this song, it's God's nature, it's God's will to forgive. And there's nowhere else to turn. David's story was pointing ahead to when Jeremiah called the new covenant, where God writes on our hearts, where God tells us inside what we need to do. If I stop and listen on the inside, I know what's the right thing to do. And today Jesus says his new covenant is on behalf of the whole creation. Some Greeks and Gentiles come to him. He says, now's the time for him to be glorified. And he's been lifting the weakest and the least people, including his own family. He's tried to stop them for their own sakes and theirs, and for fear that the Romans will step in, but he keeps going. And now he has this idea of God dwelling inside himself. It's not just going to be about him. He says it's about all of us, and as long as he is alive, we're going to be counting on him, and if that grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, it brings up a whole field of wheat to be harvested for the world. Jesus says when he's lifted up, he's going to lift everybody to himself, to his way of friendship with God rather than fear, to the way of empowerment of the poor and the least rather than domination over them, the way of forgiving rather than holding a grudge, the way of making peace rather than fighting, the way of sharing so that there will be scarcity for none. So in John's Gospel, Jesus isn't dying for anybody's sins. He's laying down his life for his friends. In John's Gospel, Jesus doesn't want us to look at the cross and feel guilty about it. He wants us to know he would live that way all over again, even with the same ending. And he asks us to follow him. He's asking us to follow him, to acknowledge whatever is going on in our lives and follow him. Tyler Clementi committed suicide when his roommate, Ravi Jaran, outed him for being gay. Tyler had grown up in a church where he was told God hated who he was. Ravi, like King David, did not intend for Tyler to die. He said something, and he let something loose, and a horrible thing happened. Ravi will have Tyler's death ever before him. And he needs forgiveness, and he needs some way to move forward himself so that two young men don't die. The homophobic church needs to face what it's doing. It is killing children. And it needs to ask God's forgiveness. It needs to change. Trayvon Martin was murdered in Florida because an armed 28-year-old vigilante decided the 17-year-old looked like trouble. Our society is fostering the killing of minority young people by pushing fear. And Jesus says, loving your neighbor as yourself, and he goes to the cross because God loves the world, and in Jesus, God will experience on that cross what Trayvon has experienced, and what Tyler has experienced, and what Uriah the Hittite has experienced, and what all those abused and abandoned animals have experienced. And seeing him crucified, says Jesus, we will begin to see what we do to God every time we commit violence against any one of God's creatures. For God is in fact in every human being. And God is in fact in every part of the creation. Like David, with Uriah, like Pilate with Jesus, like our culture with Tyler and Trayvon. We crucify God when we allow any to be killed senselessly. May it begin with us. And may God forgive us and create in us a clean heart. And may God help us to be the yeast and the mustard seed in this world that begins to make the difference, and seeing that the violence must stop and that it takes a new heart from God to do it. When we look at the cross, let us see God suffering as a human being, the way God suffers every time a human being is wounded. Amen. Amen.